Welcome to the evening review show for this evening. My name is Jemima Beekes, your host. Let's have a look at tomorrow's headlines before we go into today's interview. Namibia drops on corruption index. Police impersonations escalates. NASFOF board accused of hijacking in Guete's disciplinary process. Now, the High Court ruled recently against an application of gay couples Daniel Digashu, Johan Potgieter, Anette Seiler-Lilles and Anita Seiler-Lilles to have their marriages recognized because it is bound by what he calls the Frank ruling. Today we're speaking to expert from the Legal Assistance Center, Dianne Hubbard, who will just help us flesh out some of the technicalities of this verdict. Thank you for joining us, Dianne.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Dianne, can you please help us understand what gave rise to the application by these two couples?
Sure. In both cases, let me first start with the normal situation is if you're a Namibian citizen and you get married to a non-citizen somewhere outside Namibia, you can normally return to Namibia and your spouse will have the right to come to Namibia and live with you. The difficulty here is that because these couples both got same-sex marriages in countries where this is allowed, their spouses were not recognized by Namibia in the same way as if they were in a heterosexual marriage. The case was looking at.
Are you there, Dianne?
Yeah.
Yeah. So before we go into the rest of the interview, just some clarity. What is the Namibian Constitution's position on same-sex marriage, and what does it mean when they talk about just help us understand that.
Okay, well, that's actually the question that the court is grappling with. It's not straightforwardly addressed in the Constitution. So what the court said in this case was there is a judgment that came up many years ago called the Frank case that was decided by the Supreme Court. And that was a case where there was a lesbian couple, one Namibian was not, and the non-citizen was seeking permanent residence. That couple was not married because back then various countries allowed same-sex marriage. So the court here said that the Frank case said we're not going to consider this relationship to be a factor in an application for permanent residence. Now, what the court in the case that was recently decided has said is, we think that the Supreme Court judgment in that case many years ago was wrong, but we're a high court. We can't go against the Supreme Court. We're bound to follow the Supreme Court, but we think it was wrong. And so now the only court that can change the old decision is the Supreme Court. You know, it can reverse itself, but a lower court can't go against the higher court.
Just for the layman to understand, what does this verdict mean?
Well, what I think it is that the high court gave its reasons, many reasons, why they thought that the Frank judgment was incorrect. So probably what will happen is that the case will now go to the Supreme Court. There was a press report that indicated that the parties are likely to appeal. And so the Supreme Court is still going to have to decide. One thing I want to emphasize for people, though, is the question in this case at the moment is quite narrow. It is about recognition of a same-sex marriage from another country. The case is not about whether people who live in Namibia, who are both Namibians, should be allowed to engage in a same-sex marriage. That's a question for another day. That's not raised in this case, just to avoid confusion. This is about marriages that were concluded in South Africa where same-sex marriage is permitted. And the question is whether or not Namibia will recognize that South African marriage.
So during the court proceedings, what is the legal question that the High Court had to interrogate and answer?
Whether or not it would be discriminatory not to recognize the same-sex marriage, since we would recognize a marriage from South Africa if it involved people of opposite sexes.
Then there's obviously the issue about the Frank ruling. Number one, I want to ask two issues around the Frank ruling. What was the Frank ruling?
Well, that is kind of $1 million question in a way, because usually when a court makes a decision, there will be the reason that is the fundamental basis for the decision, and then often there's a lot of other discussion, in the course of coming to the decision. Part of what the disagreement was about is the Frank case was a very long, very complicated judgment. So part of what people disagree about is what was actually, what it was very specifically about was an application for permanent residence by someone who was a lesbian partner in an informal cohabitation. So the Frank case did not address a formal marriage from another country. But in this case, the High Court said, we think that the Frank judgment held that same-sex relationships of any kind cannot be recognized in Namibia. But the High Court said, we can't disagree with the Frank, we can't overrule the Frank case, but we think it was wrong. We think it was wrongly decided. Quite importantly, the High Court said that it would be discriminatory to not recognize the full human rights of gay and lesbian people in Namibia. And I think that's a really, really important point made by the High Court. The High Court also said they believe that both sex and social status in Article 10 of the Namibian Constitution would cover sexual orientation, meaning that you cannot discriminate against anyone in Namibia on the grounds of sexual orientation. But now the Supreme Court will have to have the final say on this.
So Article 10 talks about not discriminating against people?
Yeah.
And this obviously includes people of same-sex marriages, right?
Well, that's what the High Court has said in this case, because the Frank case said, look, sex does not include sexual orientation. But the High Court now has said, what I think quite correctly, that's simply not tenable. And they said, even whatever you think about the word sex, social status, which is also in Article 10, certainly also includes sexual orientation. So discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation would be unconstitutional, according to the High Court.
So then where does that leave the sodomy law?
It doesn't, obviously this doesn't address the sodomy law directly, but it certainly would be a point in favor of striking down the sodomy law, because the sodomy law is a discriminatory law that applies, not only does it discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation, but it also discriminates between men and women, because it only criminalizes acts that men do together and nothing that two women would do together. So it's discriminatory in a number of different ways.
Then still on the Frank ruling, there are also sentiments that the Frank ruling was a reflection of society at the time, 20 years ago. And now the Frank ruling basically still stands. Does that mean we are still a reflection? Society as it is right now is still a reflection of what that Frank ruling has pointed out?
Well, certainly the world has moved on in its attitudes about same-sex relationships. But the thing with the court ruling is it doesn't expire simply because it's old. But that is what is important. The Constitution gives the Supreme Court the right to reverse itself when an opinion was wrongly decided, or it becomes outdated, or it's no longer relevant. So that is what we are reconsidering the Frank judgment, and we can decide to reverse ourselves, because the world has changed, understandings have changed, and I believe, even at the time, I believe that personally, that the Frank judgment was wrongly decided.
And then obviously, as you've said earlier, and as the High Court has also advised, the parties can take the matter to the Supreme Court, who then can overturn its own ruling. In your view, as an expert, having seen and read society and the Namibian landscape over the last few years, what are the chances of success for such an application?
You know, it's always hard to predict, but I think it's quite important that we have not just the High Court, but a three-bench panel of the High Court that unanimously said, we think the Frank case was wrong. I feel that the Supreme Court will certainly give some serious consideration to the views of, three judges of the High Court. They will certainly, want to take careful notice of the views that have been expressed, done very respectfully by the High Court. But the High Court has basically said we think that the Supreme Court should consider to reverse itself, and it gave a long analysis of why. And so I think that certainly there seems to be a prospect of success in light of that sentiment.
Then speaking about sentiments, homophobia is still a very big deal in Namibia. Do you think we Namibians are going to become more tolerant in future? What do you think needs to happen for Namibians to understand that everyone has an equal right to...
I think tolerance is such an important value, and I think that's something, tolerance of all kinds is something we need to start inculcating in the youth. But I also think that often the political homophobia is stronger than what you find at community level. I think in some ways that that Namibian society is following the lead of some of the political leaders who have spoken out about this issue. And if political leaders were rather encouraging tolerance and mutual respect for people regardless of their sexual or what have you, then I think we'd be moving in a better direction as a society.
Do you therefore feel and believe that we need an overhaul, complete eradication of the sodomy law?
I absolutely do. I mean, it's something that really infringes the dignity of gay couples, and yet it's unenforceable because think about it. It's two consenting adults. It's the only people the sodomy law applies to. What sexual acts they're engaging in would almost certainly be in private. So how on earth would such a law even be enforced? It's on the book, and it's making people feel threatened and feel discriminated against for no actual purpose at all. So I think it is really quite shameful that law is still on the books in Namibia. The Law Reform and Development Commission, which is a statutory body in Namibia, has released a report recommending the repeal of the law on sodomy.
Dianne, that book that has been on the laws that need to be repealed, that includes the sodomy law, has been released a few years ago. We've seen in the last few years an increasing demand for this law to be removed or taken away. And yet we don't see any movement towards it actually being abolished. What do you think must be done to speed up this process?
Well, I think if Parliament doesn't act, eventually this case will also go to the courts. And we're already seeing in the recent Lilles case, the High Court also made a strong statement that there must be no discrimination against people in Namibia on the grounds of sexual orientation. This was the case concerning citizenship of the children born to a gay couple through surrogacy. That case is also on appeal to the Supreme Court. So it seems to me that we're seeing movement in the courts toward insisting or pointing out that the Constitution simply does not allow discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And that's exactly the role of a Constitution. If you're a majority in your viewpoints, you don't usually need the protection of the Constitution. It's particularly important to protect people who have unpopular views or unpopular lifestyles. The Constitution protects every person in Namibia. So that's why I think the role of the courts is very important here.
Dianne, lastly, before we conclude, on the streets, the question that people usually answer when cases like this make it to court or in the media is, why does a gay couple have to, gay couple have to go to court to fight for their rights? Why can't they just live their lives at home? What, in your view, are the impacts of living such a life without being allowed or accorded the full rights that you are entitled to?
I think it's a terrible infringement of the dignity of the people who are affected. And I only can say that I really admire the people who are willing to take these issues to court to try to anybody who's facing this infringement of their dignity. I really admire the people who are bringing these challenges because I think it takes a lot of courage to stand up and do this. So I'm have disrespect.
Are you still there, Dianne?
I am.
Oh, you are. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. God bless.
One, two, three,